Welcome back to the True Crime Lounge podcast. I do have a Patreon that you can go and join for early access to episodes scheduled to come out. So I have a merch shop for all your true crime gear. For any updates on my channel or podcast, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. With that being said, why don't we dive into today's episode? Today we're going to be talking about an old Hollywood case. I love the classics, and some of them will not even be made today. It was the golden age of Hollywood, and we need more movies like this. Please don't cancel me for loving an age of cinema that you don't like, or just so radical at the time. Um, but today's case, we're going to be talking about Bob Crane. Um, Bob Crane was born in Waterbury, Connecticut, on July 13th, 1928. His parents were Thomas and Rosemary Crane. His brother was Alfred John. Bob was married twice. He was married to Ann Teresia and then married Patricia Olson. Wonder if there's any relation to the Olsen twins or in Elizabeth. Now, he was the father of four, with three from Anne and one adopted from Patty. Now, although he was born in Waterbury around 1930, his family moved to Stamford, Connecticut. And this is where Alfred John and he grew up. The Cranes moved around during the 30s and through the 40s. They would leave Connecticut briefly in the mid 30s, and when Bob's dad was worked at a department store in Poughkeepsie, New York, the Cranes would return to Stanford in 1936. Bob would graduate from Stanford High School in 1946, and after graduation, he would work at a Finley Status jury department and Stanford, and then enlisted in the Stanford National Guard, where he served from 1948 and he was discharged in 1950. Music was extremely important to Bob, and in 1939, at the age of 10, he first heard the legendary drummer Gene Grouper, who played at the New York World's Fair. From that moment on, he knew he wanted to be a drummer. And by middle school, he was forming his own bands with the neighborhood kids and teaching kids how to play drums so that they could march in the parade. In high school, he played in the school orchestra, marching band, and jazz band, which during his senior year was known as the Crane Casino Jazz Concert. The, j- the jazz band would perform regularly for school functions as well as for other gigs in Stanford and the neighboring towns, including Greenwich, Norwich, and Darien. According to the Bridgeport Symphony Orchestra, Bob also performed the timpani with the Connecticut Symphony and Orchestra while still in high school as part of the orchestra school music program. School friends will also recall him playing with the Norwich Symphony during this time, and it was his love of music that will lead him to pursue a career in radio. Now, upon graduating from high school in 1946, he would be sending audition tapes out to the radio stations down the East Coast. And in 1949, he took a course at the University of Bridgeport in station operation, instructed by Wally Dumlot. And though he though discouraged by the rejection responses he received, he did not give up. In the early 1950s, he received a call from WLEA in Hornell, New York, and WLEA is credited with offering Bob his first job in radio. Bob would spend 10 months there, and he achieved the role of program director before his departure in December 1950 when he accepted an offer at WBIS in Bristol, Connecticut. Wanting to be back in his home state, he had continued to send audition tapes to radio stations in Connecticut. He was, however, rejected repeatedly. But because his voice was not as slow as stations desired, but instead fast and frantic, even WBIS was taken by surprise when they met him in person. The tape station had played his audition tape more slowly than normal, so they had expected someone who sounded like Edward R. Morrow. Despite the glitch, WBIS was impressed with his talents, and he was soon hired. He quickly promoted to senior announcer and program director. His time in Bristol was short, however, and by April 1951 he had moved to WLIZ in Bridgeport, where he was promptly became the area's new town crier. And Bob would often say that he had been hired to radio stations for all sorts of bizarre reasons. In this case, Wally Dunlap had been searching for a new morning man for the WLIZ. The one stipulation, he must not drink alcohol. Not a drinker, and because Dunlap had known Bob from his college course, and Bob had earned a time slot at WLIZ. On November 17, 1951, WLIZ purchased WICC for 190,000. And Crane's morning show shifted to WICC, and soon after, he was promoted to the program director. While there, he worked at the he worked at the Wake's UHF television station, Channel 43, and was a well-known Bridgeport figure. Morgan calling home during his time, the UHF television was in its was in its infancy, and the station floundered despite his ongoing efforts of Crane and Cohen. Bob remained at Wick until August 11, 1956, when his final morning show on the Wick Air Race. He and his family moved out to Los Angeles, where 1 month later, on September 3rd, he launched his show into the Southern California audience over the KNX CBS radio. At KNX, Crane would hone his perfect his radio show and become one of the premier celebrities interviewers at the time. Crane's radio show was unique in many ways. And early as his days at WLEA, he was experimenting with sound effects. For example, he would put water in a salt shaker, and while promoting Borden's milk, he would shake the water over a cup of water, saying that the listeners that he was milking the cow while they're at the studio. So how fresh could it be? Could the milk be? Another sound effect was the chicken crackling and the egg flop, where he would rate records based on how many eggs would drop in a basket. From there, he graduated to voice impersonations, some famous, some not. And as soon as he became known as KNX Man of Thousand Voices, all these gimmicks, as Bob called them, were interwoven into the radio show. And most of the time in which commercials, which was unprecedented, by the time he reached KNX, advertisers were paying top dollar airtime during the Bob Crane show simply because he could get people to stay put, pay attention, and actually enjoy the commercials. Also, um, are you see? Okay. Also, central to Bob Crane's radio show, was the drumming. Wherever Bob went, his drums went with him. He incorporated his musicianship into his radio program. When the playing of a radio record over the air, he could often not resist the urge to play his drums with it. Further, he was an exceptional interviewer, which earned him a coveted place in many celebrities. While at KNX, Bob interviewed more than 3,000 individuals from September 13, 1956 to August 16, 1965, including, but not limited to, Jacqueline Gillette, Jane Meadows, Rob Sterling, Paula Prentice, Arthur Godfrey, Carol Lawrence, and John Gary and Dick Clark. Um, while they knew they were most likely going to get a good ribbing from Crane, they also knew I am not letting that window up. Windshield. I am not opening those. What? I am not opening that. Sorry, I'm dog sitting for my roommate, and she likes to look out the window, but she's gonna start barking up a storm, and I'm trying to get this episode done. But anyway, um, because of this tremendous success in the radio, and specifically the celebrity interview portion, Bob was inundated with offers from producers to host his own TV show. He guest hosted, um, and filled the spot for Jack Hart on The Tonight Show and as for Johnny Carson on Who Do You Trust? But he didn't want to transition his radio career show to television, and he turned down the offers, including to replace Hart on The Tonight Show. His refusal to host The Tonight Show left the door wide open for Johnny Carson to accept and become the king of the late night. Let's talk about his acting career in Hogan's Hero. Instead of Instead, he turned his interest into acting. In 1959, he started performing in the community theater as soon as his no acting clause in the KNX had expired in 1961. Started taking small roles in television parts. One of his earliest roles was on The Twilight Zone, where he played a radio announcer. Um, and in 1962, he earned a role on the Dick Van Dyke Show. Somebody has to play Cleopatra as Harry Rogers. Um, Also, Donna Reed took notice of Crane's acting talents and soon landed him a permanent role on the Donna Reed Show as Dr. David Kelsey. From 1963 to 1965, Bob worked two full-time jobs, running back and forth between KNX and the Donna Reed Show. And during this time, he began to take acting very seriously. With Donna Reed's encouragement, in 1964 he took a course of acting taught by Stella Adler. As Bob improved his acting techniques, he grew as an actor. He became restless with the premise of the Donna Reed show. He wanted a show that was not the father husband next door role. Instead wanted a television series that he could be very different. He left the show on December 1st, 1964, but he did not leave over wanting an increase in salary, nor was he fired. He was released from the series without incident, and he immediately received offers from producers starring in various television series, including My Mother the Car and Please Don't Eat the Daisies. But he would turn down all offers except for one. He was approached in December 24 with a new series about being produced during World War II. At first, he was not sure about the premise. But after reading the script and talking with the producer, Edward Edward H. Feldman, he decided to audition, and on December sorry y'all. And on December 22nd, 1964, he did a screen test with Warner Klepner, and the chemistry between the two was instant. Crane was offered the role of Colonel Hogan on Hogan's Heroes. He accepted the role and agreed to film the pilot episode, which filmed in January 1965. However, he wanted to be sure he would not offend veterans and former POWs. He insisted that a trailer be sent to the veterans group in the Midwest to ask for their feedback. They loved it, claiming that without the humor, they would never have made it through the war. Bob was sold. Hogan's Hero was picked up by CBS for 1965 fall season, and the production of season one took place throughout the late winter, early spring of that year. Even before the first episode appeared September 17, 1965, he had high hopes for the series. In 1965, he gambled through everything on the success of Hogan's Heroes. He resigned from KNX in August 1965 and was concentrated on Hogan's Heroes. It had a lot of success too, and Crane was nominated twice for an Emmy Award. While on hiatus during Hogan's Heroes, he saw comedic roles in films from Wicked Dreams of Paula Schultz, ABC's Arsenic and Old Lace, and Disney's Super Dad, and on television. Following the cancellation of Hogan's Heroes in March 1971, he took guest starring roles in various television shows and had his brief run on his own series in 1975, The Bob Crane Show. However, he was unable to completely take a break from his public image as Colonel Hogan, and perhaps the one role for which he never receives the credit was his guest starring roles in The Love Boat in early 1978. The role performed as a dramatic role where he must break down and cry as he performed exceptionally well, and he was finally starting to apply what he learned from his method of being an actor. But because of this, the episode aired so soon before his murder that it had been depressing to watch and the view entirely different than he had lived.